All right, we'll go ahead and get started. So I decided to look at Romans just because this whole week I've had a very extensive discussion or debate with some brethren in Mexico on Romans. And so all my study this week, all my thought has been there, so I just thought it would be more appropriate, even though it's jumping out of what we've been talking about. I don't necessarily like doing that, but I think I'm more prepared to speak on this subject than I was on 1 John, so that's why we're going to look at Romans, just because that's what I've been dealing with all week. All right, so we're going to look at Romans, but I want to look at it from an exegetical standpoint, not from a interpretive standpoint or like a commentary, but as an exegesis. So before I do that, I want to explain what that is, because I found that a lot of people, in fact, for me, for years and years, did not even know the word existed, right? Exegesis, that's a strange word. My wife hates that word. She says she never wants to hear me say it again, but you're going to hear it a lot today. And so we're going to talk about what is exegesis. So the textbook definition, or the dictionary definition, is it's a critical explanation or interpretation of a text, especially of Scripture. But let's look at that and try to explain better what that means. So we could say, if we just take and expand those words out, we could say it's a detailed, scholarly, analytical explanation or interpretation of a text, especially of a Scripture. And to make that even, I think, a little more clear, this is how I would explain it. It's a detailed examination of the elements and structure of the text for the purpose of understanding its intended meaning and proper applications. I hope that's clear. So it's a detailed examination of the elements and the structure of the text. So you take a text, like today, the idea is Romans, right? So you take Romans as an entire text, the whole book, and you examine the elements of it, the rhetorical elements, and the way it's structured, the way it's written, right? And the reason you do this is to understand what the author intended to say. That's what you're looking for. What did Paul mean to say when he wrote Romans? Now, if you go back and you listen to most evangelical, fundamentalist type preaching, this is not what they're doing. They take fragments of the text and they say what they want to say. Now, I'm not saying that what they're saying is wrong. Almost everything that the fundamentalists preach is right, because their doctrine's right. But it isn't because they've examined the text and they go, oh, look what Paul is saying. Okay? So exegesis is the idea is that I want to understand what Paul meant when he wrote this, and how then can it be properly applied. Okay? Now, that is not to say that interpretation and application are wrong. It's just not exegesis. So exegesis is understanding what Paul meant to say. Interpretation then is understanding what that means together. What are these things? How can they be understood? So it's not to take the place of interpretation. I think the first thing we should do when we're going to speak on a text is we should do the exegesis of the text. We should first understand what it meant and why the author wrote it originally, what he meant by this. And then we can take and say, how can we interpret this? And then we can say, how can we apply this? Where we can take something that isn't necessarily the way it's written, but it's a valid application of it. And so that we're not going to get into all of that, but I just want you to understand. So when I'm talking of exegesis, I'm talking specifically of understanding how it's written. Okay? Why does exegesis matter? Well, it matters because it's the opposite of what's called eisegesis. Eisegesis. It's the opposite of exegesis. We'll talk about that in a minute. And I think it's the cure to what's called proof texting, where you just have an idea or you have a doctrine or you have something you want to say, and you just go to the Bible and find a verse that appears to say that. So it's that. So let's talk about eisegesis for a moment. What is eisegesis? Eisegesis is the process of interpreting text in such a way as to introduce one's own presuppositions agendas, or biases, it is commonly referred to as reading into the text. So let me give you a more down-to-earth explanation. Eisegesis is where you read into the text what you want to see. Exegesis is where you read out of the text what it says. Let me give you a visual example. This could be a metaphor or analogy of exegesis. Okay? It's an analysis of these, of the bone structure and everything. They're looking and seeing what is there and analyzing it and breaking it down into its components. This would be eisegesis. This is where you look up at the clouds and see the animals. We've all done this. Everyone's looked up at the cloud. Hey, that looks like an elephant. Okay? Now, that is not an elephant. The cloud was not designed to look like an elephant. It has no intention of being an elephant. And the only people who think it looks like an elephant are the people who know what an elephant looks like. Okay? Everybody in the world has looked at the clouds and seen animals in them. But no new species has ever been discovered by looking at the clouds. Because you only see in the clouds what you expect to see. Okay? That's eisegesis. Eisegesis is where you look at the text and you see what you expect to see. This is the problem with preaching, where you sit down, or with preaching or teaching, and you sit down and say, what do I want to preach? I want to preach on this subject. Now I'm going to go find a verse that talks about that. Now that doesn't mean that what you say is wrong. Again, this goes back to what I said about fundamental evangelicals. Most of what they preach is right, even though I think they get there completely the wrong way. The reason it's right is because what they think is right. But here's the problem, here's the danger with eisegesis. If you're wrong on anything, you contaminate every text with that error. Because you are putting your reading into the text what you want to see there, what you expect to see there. Okay? So if you're wrong, and we're all wrong on some things, so if you're wrong, then you're putting your error into the text, not allowing the text to correct your error. You understand? And if you're right, you neuter every text of any meaning you're unfamiliar with. So if you start off to say, I'm going to preach, and I'm going to preach on baptism, and I'm going to go find passages that deal with baptism, well then all you are ever going to see in those texts is what? Baptism. Because that's what you're looking for. What you're looking for, that's what you're going to find. And you're not going to find anything different, and you're certainly not going to find anything that says, hey, wait a minute, maybe I'm wrong on this. Where the exegetical approach to this would be to say, I am going to study this text and try to understand not what doctrine it teaches, I'm going to try to understand how it's written. Just the grammatical, rhetorical structure, how it's composed, and then build from there. Now, this is a very slow and laborious process. I'm not going to lie to you. It is far easier to just say, give me a concordance, and let's look up everywhere where it says baptism in the Bible, and let's just read all those verses. But that is proof texting. All right? And let's get to that. What is proof texting? It's the practice of using isolated, out-of-context quotations from scriptures to establish a proposition. So you want to establish that salvation is by grace, not by works. And so you go find every verse that says, not of works, by grace, and there it is. It's proven. Now, generally speaking, you will be right, because salvation is not of grace, not of works, it is of grace. Right? And so you say, then what's the problem? Well, not everything we try to prove this way is actually that concrete. And we do make mistakes. And it's not honoring to the text to do so. The Bible was not written, for the most part, the way Proverbs is written. Proverbs is like the only book in the Bible that actually lends itself to this type of approach. And not entirely, but for the most part, right? There are sections in Proverbs that aren't that way, but for the most part, Proverbs is just like a collection of wise sayings. And many times, they have no connection from one to the other. It's just like randomly on there, or seemingly randomly anyways for our purposes. And so it's just like, okay, you can do that. You can say, hey, what does Proverbs say about hard work? And you can go find 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 little verses, little sayings about work, and it's like, okay, that's what Proverbs says about hard work. None of the other books of the Bible are written this way. Especially not when we get to the New Testament, we're dealing with the epistles. They are not written this way. But that's how we are using them. Let me give you an example of proof texting. I'm not here to discuss or litigate whether dispensationalism is a proper view of world history. But let's just take the idea of dispensationalism, and this is one of the proof texts used by many dispensationalists to prove that it is biblical. Because it says that in the dispensation of the fullness of times, and they go, there it is, it's in the Bible. That is, even if dispensationalism is 100% right, it is not right because of this verse. That is not what this text is saying. It only proves it if you read that phrase only. If you actually examine Ephesians exegetically, it has nothing to do with that. Nothing at all. So the question is, how do we read the Bible? And I believe you should read the Bible exegetically. Here's another example. Do we make void the law through faith? God forbid. Yea, we establish the law. This is the one that everyone who believes we should be keeping the law of Moses will read you. We establish the law. That's a little fragment of a sentence in the middle of a sea of argument. That does not, the argument is not establish the law. The whole argument of Romans is not, hey, let's establish the law. Not at all. In fact, once he says this, he doesn't mention the law again for 3 more chapters. Completely taking this out of context of what he's saying. But that's proof texting. And everybody has a proof text. If any of you have any ability whatsoever to argue for the faith or to talk to somebody about doctrine, I can tell you, does baptism save? Boom, you can give me a verse. Is Jesus God? Boom, you give me a verse. We all have these verses, like here they are. Book, chapter, verse. Book, chapter, verse. Boom, 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 I can prove everything. And for the most part, I would say that the verses we quote are pretty much that's what they're saying. But they're not all saying that. And I'm not convinced that even if they are saying that, that is the correct approach. It's not the approach we find from the New Testament authors. That is not their approach. Okay, so how do we exegete a text? How do we perform exegesis? That's what I want to look at briefly. So let's look at this. First, I want you to understand, this isn't actually how, but it's the very most important part. There are no shortcuts to this. Proof texting is attractive because it's easy. You just find a verse that says what you're saying. And if you can't find a verse that says what you're saying, then you change what you're saying so that you can have a verse that says that. Like, for instance, when people argue for the Trinity. There is no verse in the Bible that says the word Trinity. So they redefine it. They call it something different. They call it, I believe in the Godhead. Because there's a verse that has the word Godhead. That is an exegesis. That's taking shortcuts. Okay? So I don't think you should do that. I think you should understand that there are no shortcuts to understanding the Bible properly. Just like there's no shortcuts to understanding any other thing properly. Do you think if you go and take a literature class, let's say a 19th century English literature class, that they're going to say, hey, if you don't really want to read the whole book, you can do it this way. You can read every 7th page and get the gist of it. No, that's probably not what the professor is going to recommend to you. He's going to say, if you're taking my class, you need to read the entire book. We're discussing how the author has put together this work of literature, and you need to read it all to be able to understand it all. No shortcuts. Now, I know most of you read the whole Bible. The problem is how we read the Bible. We'll get to that in a minute. Now, the second thing, and this is really where you really start doing it, how do you do an exegesis? The first thing is you consider the full context. You do not start in Romans chapter 3, verse 23. You do not start in Romans 5:8. That's not where you start. Where do you start? If you want to understand Romans, where do you start? Romans 1:1. What's the context of Romans? Romans is the context. When people say, oh, you took that verse out of context, it's not the chapter. The chapter is not the context. The book is the context. So you have to consider the full context. Third thing is, you need to read the text normally. The way you would normally read text. Let me give you an example. I'm going to ask, I'll ask you, Mom, if you do me a favor. I'm going to put something up on the screen. I just want you, if you could read it for us out loud. All right? Just read it for us out loud.
1, practically every Bible is formatted. 2, in a way difficult to read regardless of how well. 3, it is translated, making understanding difficult. But if people would read it, 4, right, they would not be so ignorant of what it actually says and means.
You understand what that says? How about if we read it normally? Try it again, Mom.
Practically every Bible is formatted in a way difficult to read, regardless of how well it is translated, making understanding difficult. But if people would read it right, they would not be so ignorant of what it actually says and means.
It says the exact same thing. The only difference is I broke it into paragraphs and numbered them. Same punctuation. Same exact punctuation. Everything's the same. I broke it into paragraphs, numbered them, and capitalized the first letter. You know what is basically the only book in the world that does that? The Bible. That's what it does. Now, verse references, verse numbers are wonderful for referencing. Tremendous invention. It's probably one of the best inventions ever. It's so brilliant. It was such a simple thing. It took them 1,500 years to come up with it. And in 1500, Robert Stephanus came up with verse numberings, and it's like, what a brilliant, it's genius. But for reading, for comprehension, it's horrible. It's like the worst thing that ever happened to the Bible for reading and comprehension. Because we are trained from the time we're born to read a certain way. Capital letters mean something. Carriage returns mean something. Numbered lists mean something. Our brain looks at everything we see written and we read it the way she read that. Now, if you don't think the Bible breaks it up, and I know this is a little bit exaggerated, but not much. There are verses in the Bible that break the sentences mid-sentence with no punctuation. So, I think if you want to properly understand the Bible, you need to read it normally. The way you would read it. Paul, I know I've listened to sermons, heard sermons, where they try to make a lot of emphasis, like this is the 7th verse of the 7th chapter in the 7th book. This is ridiculous. The authors of the Bible did not break their text into chapters or verses. This is a much later development. So, reading it normally means reading it the way you would read any other text. Now, like I've said before, I have on our website, the church website, if you look up at the top right-hand corner, there's a little link that says the Reader's Bible. And in it I have put plain text files of the entire New Testament, every book in its own file. You can download it on your phone, your iPad, your computer. It's just a plain text file open on anything at all. You don't have to have any special software. You can just open it up. And all the chapters are gone, all the verses are gone, and it's just a single paragraph of text. I would encourage you to start reading that. It's the King James Bible, it just doesn't have verses and chapters. You'll be surprised that things that you used to think were standalone clauses are actually fragments of sentences. Now, I know that people that are very good at reading, I consider myself to be very good at reading. I've been reading my whole life, a lot more than most people. I know that people are very good at reading and say, well, I can just look past them. Well, I'm very good at reading, and I find that I don't always just look past this. My brain is trained to break at carriage returns. My brain is trained to see a capital letter and assume it's the beginning of a sentence. So, I would encourage you, if you want to do exegesis, you need to read the text normally. Fourth thing, you need to pay attention to the vocabulary, to the grammar, and to the logical structure of the text. By vocabulary, I do not mean do word studies. That's not what I'm talking. I don't find hardly, I find hardly zero utility in word studies. Especially not when we're doing them in English or one of these other languages like that. I just don't hardly find any use at all to that. But paying attention to vocabulary is. Why not word studies? Word studies, the problem with word studies generally is that they traverse more than the book and more than the author. So like with Paul, right, you could look at how Paul uses a word through his epistles, and that might be meaningful. Now you got to be careful because they don't translate to English from Greek with the King James translators themselves said that they did not translate with tremendous precision from Greek to English. They weren't concerned about the idea of word studies. If you read what's it called, the preface to the reader, they say that. They're very clear. It's one of their big points they make. This isn't a word study Bible. So that's a problem there. But you can look at it and say, okay, I'm going to look at how Paul uses the word baptism, or how he uses the word church, or how he uses the word sin or law or whatever, and you can do that. And within Paul, that would be okay. But when you start going past the author, or even past the book, well, then I think you're getting into eisegesis. You're getting into seeing what you want to see. Because there are only 6,000 words in the Greek New Testament or the English New Testament. Pretty much every language has about the same number of words. There's about 6,000 words. They're reusing these words for a lot of different ideas. So you have to be very careful with that. But you do need to be very careful with vocabulary, how the word is being used, how words are being employed in the text that you're examining, and especially the grammar. How these words are being put together into phrases and sentences and paragraphs. I believe that the authors of the Bible were very cautious and they were very judicious on how they employed these things. And you need to be looking at the logical structure, which is different than the grammar. So there, like for instance, when you're in Paul's a good place to start because he's very logical. And he builds a logical structure. Hebrews is one of the easiest ones to see this in, where he builds this logical structure. And you can see it if you start paying attention, all right? But that's what you need to start doing, paying attention to these things. We obviously don't have time to go deep into each one right now. I just want to kind of point this out. But let's look at vocabulary quickly, what I'm talking about. So here's an example of this. Romans 3:27, Paul says, "Where is boasting then? It is excluded." And you can go back and look at the full context. I just want to point this out. And then, what is he referring to? Well, if you look at the text, he says in 2:17, he's talking of the Jews who have the law, that they make their boast of God. So this is where we see where vocabulary is helpful, because he's saying, where is boasting then? Now, the grammatical structure of this statement leads you to realize he is referring to something before. That's what the word then, right, is meant to do. It is meant to conjure in your mind, I am referring to something previously talked about. Where is boasting then? So you look back up and you go, oh, look here, this is what he's talking about. That the Jew makes his boast in God, and then he goes through and makes a logical argument against this, and then when he gets done, he says, so then where is boasting? You see how that ties that in? And so there we're seeing vocabulary, and we're seeing grammar, and we're seeing a logical structure here. And you'll find this throughout all the epistles. Now, you need to understand that the epistles have a more complex structure than any of the other books of the Bible. This is my opinion, but this is how I see it. The epistles, especially those of Paul, have an extremely complex structure. Grammatically, they're complex. The sentences are incredibly long. I mean, they're ridiculously long. We're not going to look at it, but if you looked at Romans 1, this is just a random sample. It's not even the longest possible example I could give you. But Romans 1, 28 through 32 is one sentence. It's not just one sentence because the translators didn't know where to put a period. There is grammatical rules that define what a sentence is. And newer Bibles, modern translations, will break these long sentences into multiple sentences to make it easier for the average reader to be able to read them. How do they do that? They insert additional words. You can't just put a period wherever you want. It doesn't work that way. A sentence basically has to have subject, verb, object. Right? That's a normal sentence. SVO, that's how our language is. So Mike ran to the store. You got a subject, a verb, and an object. How do we know that these long sentences are one real, because that's what they have. They have one subject. Okay? So what do? The modern translations, if they want to break those into smaller sentences, they supply the subject each time. So if the subject is God, every small new sentence will start with God again. And you'll look at that and you'll see they say God a lot more than like the King James translation does. Well, it's not because they're trying to tell you that that's in the, they're trying to break it up for you, and to make it a proper sentence, they have to supply the words. That's what they do. So they have long sentences. So when you're trying to read the Bible, you're going to find this is not like reading the McDonald's menu. Right? This is not like reading, a public health statement where it's made to be very clear and understandable by everybody. This is written by seminarians, which is basically what Paul was, right? He's this doctorate student. He has a PhD in law. And he is writing a treatise on law. And it is complex. The words he uses, the vocabulary he's using, the grammatical structure, all extraordinarily complex. One of the things you need to look for to notice this complexity are the number of parentheses that exist in these texts. It's very important to be able to identify them. So there's three kinds of, or there's two kinds, but I kind of divided it up because I want to point some out to you. So you have explicit parentheses, which we'll see in a minute. You have implicit parentheses, and you have complex ones. So let's look at an example. I'm not expecting you to read all this, but this is Romans 2, 12 through 16, okay? You see what's in red? Now that's explicit, right? Because the translators put those parentheses marks. See them? In front of them, front and the end of red. So they're telling you, what is a parenthesis? It's something that you can remove and still understand what remains, right? It's dependent but independent at the same time information. You don't have to read what's in the red to understand what's in the white, right? Now this is an explicit one. It's real simple. So if you're trying to understand Romans when you're reading it and you come across a parenthesis, one thing you should do is you should read it without the parentheses. Because that's what that means. So we say, for as many as have sinned without the law shall also perish without the law. And as many as have sinned in the law shall be judged by the law in the day when God shall judge the secrets of men by Jesus Christ according to my gospel. See how that is a succinct sentence? Now, if you were to read all the way through to there and not understanding, hey, this is a parenthesis, then when you get to the end, you're going to forget where you even were. So you have to be able to, when you're reading, you have to say, oh, this looks like it's parentheses. I need to take that out for a moment, read it without the parentheses, so I can understand what it's saying. Hebrews is a great example of an implicit parenthesis that we're not going to put up on the screen, but Hebrews is a good example. It goes Hebrews 1:1, 1:2, and then it jumps all the way down to 2:1, 2:2. And if you don't cut out the rest of 1 and put those together, you completely miss the point of what Hebrews is saying. And so many Christians that I deal with do not know what Hebrews is talking about because they do not know how to identify that grammatical structure. All right? So that's an explicit one. Those are easy. Now, what's inside of it? Well, it's a discussion about the law. Those that be judged by the law. Because he says, It's not the hearers of the law that are just before God, but the doer. That's all important, but it's subordinate. It's independent information. You can get rid of it for a moment, understand what he's saying, and then realize here he is telling you in more detail a specific bit of information about something he's mentioned. He could put that at the end of it if he wanted. He could put it as separate sentences and develop it that way. There's a lot of ways to include that information. Parentheses is the way Paul does most of it. So if you're going to try to understand the epistles of Paul, you're going to have to get familiar with identifying parentheses. They're everywhere. And most of them are not explicit. This is actually an anomaly. Most of them are implicit, meaning they don't have parentheses marks. Let me give you some examples. Here's one right here. The red is a parenthesis. Now, the punctuation helps you identify this, but that's right. So what does he say? He says, even the righteousness of God, which is by faith of Jesus Christ unto all and upon all them that believe. For there is no difference. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. Now, how do we know that's parentheses? Because how do you fit that in with what follows? Being justified freely by His grace. Who is being justified freely by His grace? Those that have sinned and come short of the glory of God? No, not exactly. It's them that believe. See, that phrase looks like, and people, I have heard seasoned preachers accuse Paul of basically just randomly writing things. Absurd. They just don't know. The problem is they are randomly reading things. Okay? It says, look at it this way, which is by faith of Jesus Christ unto all and upon all them that believe, being justified freely by His grace through the redemption that is in Christ Jesus, whom, see the quotation marks there again? The colon, yeah. Sorry, the colon, yes. Whom God has set forth. What's it? This is another parenthesis, and he's saying, Jesus Christ, what about Him? Well, that's what about Him. He says before, he says, all them that believe. All. Who, what all? Why all? Well, because there's no difference. For all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. This is additional information that you can get rid of momentarily, and it'll help you understand the text better. And then once you've understood the structure of the text, you can then go back to that information and fill in the details. Right? If I were to say, give you an example now that's not biblical. What if I were to say, Ron, the man sitting there in the brown chair, came today at 9 o'clock. What is the parentheses? The man sitting in the brown chair. Because I could just say, Ron came today at 9 o'clock. And it's a perfectly complete sentence. But if I want to clarify who Ron is, I could do it that way. Or I could say, Ron came today at 9 o'clock. He's the man sitting in the brown chair. Or I could say, the man sitting in the brown chair is Ron, and he came today at 9 o'clock. There are a number of ways of saying this. The way Paul generally writes is a lot of parentheses, which make it very hard for the casual reader to follow. So you cannot be a casual reader if you want to understand Paul. Okay, let's look at one here. This is a long one. We're not going to read it all. This is Romans 5, 1 through 11. There is an enormous parenthesis in this text. Enormous one. I want to point it out to you. We're not going to read it all. We don't have that time. But I want to point this out to you, so I've done it this way. Look at this. Wherein we stand, I'm about down at the end of the first paragraph, wherein we stand and rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. Okay? That's like verse 1. And then he says, and not only so, but we glory in tribulations. And that's like verse 2. And then he skips all the way down to verse 11 and says, and not only so, but we joy in God through our Lord Jesus Christ. Now, when you look at this, you say, oh, I see what he's doing here. Right? We rejoice in hope of the glory of God. We glory in tribulations, and we joy in God. See how we put together a little three-point sermon right there? But there's an enormous text missing. Now, how do we know that these are tied together? Well, look at this. Now, Paul does this a lot, and this will help you find these parentheses. And not only so, and then look again down there. How does he tie it in? See, back then they didn't, as far as we can tell, there was no punctuation when they were writing. If you look at the oldest manuscripts, there's no punctuation. There's not even minuscule letters. They're all majuscules. They're all uppercase, capital letters. So how do they indicate, other than context, how can they indicate that there is a parenthesis and it has ended? Paul does this a lot. He repeats the first phrase again. See that? And not only so, and then he says it, and then he has his long parentheses, and then he says, and not only so, and it's his way of basically using words to draw a parentheses mark. And they're all over the epistles of Paul. Does this all the time. Makes it real easy. So when you're reading through and you find a phrase, and then you read about 6 or 7 verses, and then he repeats that phrase, you should perk up and go, this might be a sign that there is a parenthesis here. And when you start looking at it, you go, oh, look at that. It is. He's jumping, and he's saying, I jumped from there to here, and I'm now taking up again what I originally was talking about. And that's his way of indicating that to you. It's a great way of doing it. Fantastic way. Now, I want you to see then what the parentheses would have looked like. So if we were to put the whole text back in again, that's what it looks like. And all that's in red, which is much more than the primary text, is parentheses. Now, if you don't identify that, you get down to verse 11, and he says, but we also joy in God through our Lord Jesus Christ, and it's like, okay. And you miss the connection he's trying to make to you, which is he's saying we got 3 things we should consider. We rejoice in the hope of the glory of God, we glory in tribulations, and we joy in God. Now, we don't have time to really look at it, but if you look at that, what you'll find is this is a progressive idea that he's handling. He's starting saying, as Christians, we rejoice in the hope of the glory of God. We mature into joy, to glory in tribulations, and then we mature into joying just in God. And if you consider that, that is roughly analogous to the rate or the way in which a Christian matures. First is like, I'm so happy I'm saved. And then it's, I'm so happy I get to suffer for Christ. And then it is, I'm so happy because God is good. It's a personal then relationship. It has nothing to do with what I do for God or what he does for me. It's just the relationship I have with him. That's kind of what he's saying. But you lose this if you don't identify how that works, okay? Okay, very quickly here, we talked about parentheses that make it complex. So long sentences make the text complex. Parentheses make the text complex. Multiple threads of thought, typical in Paul. He'll have 3 or 4 ideas he's hammering all of. It's like whack-a-mole with him. He's like pop, 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 pop. And so he's handling all these threads of thought at the same time. Sometimes you got to unweave them and say, okay, this has to do with the law, and this has to do over here with this, and this has to do with this. And you got to realize that he is weaving like a master weaver. He is weaving these ideas together, multiple threads of thought. You got to pay attention. And very sophisticated rhetorical devices. Many of them, not many, but some of them are lost because they don't translate, like alliteration won't translate, right? Where you start every point with the same word. That's very hard to translate. But he does some of that, and he does other types of rhetorical devices that don't translate. He does a lot of them that do translate. Like, for instance, the rhetorical question. Or the hyperbole, right? Things like that. He does all these, and you should brush up on what are rhetorical devices, because you'll find them and they'll be helpful to understand what he's saying. All right? Okay, the 5th thing you do now, going back to how you do an exegesis, you need to write a summary of what the author is saying and how it is structured. The first thing that most of us want to do when we're reading the Bible is say, what does it mean to me? What can I get out of this? That's natural. There's nothing wrong with this, but it's not how you can go about an exegesis. You are jumping right to application. Okay, that's application. What can I get out of the text? That's application. What does it mean? That's interpretation. Exegesis is, how does it say it? Because it matters. It should inform our interpretation and our application. How it says it. Why it says it. So you would write a summary. So what you do is you would take the text, analyze the structure of the text, the vocabulary of the text, the grammar of the text. You'd examine this, work out how he builds this argument, how he composes these thoughts, and try to understand what is Paul trying to tell me, not what am I trying to tell Paul. That's how most people are reading their Bibles. They're trying to figure out what they're going to tell Paul. You should be thinking, what is Paul trying to tell me? Now that's hard to do because we all have prejudices and presuppositions. We all do. Nobody approaches anything as a blank slate. We come to the Bible with the idea of salvation by grace, not of works. Jesus is God. There is a hell, right? The church is the body of Christ. These are all presuppositions. They're not necessarily wrong, but they are. So nobody is coming to the Bible as a blank slate. So it's very difficult to do this very completely objectively. Probably impossible. But we ought to try as hard as we can to say, I want to read this text and let it speak to me, as opposed to me speaking through it. That's the difference between exegesis and eisegesis. And it's not easy to do. I'm not pretending that this is easy. This is hard. There are entire college courses to teach you how to do this with regular literature. Okay? So it is hard, but you should try to do it. You should try to do it. And if you're not good at it, you should talk to people who are and have them show you what it's saying. There's nothing wrong with being taught. We don't all have to reinvent the wheel every day. Right? If you're good at it, then do it and teach others. If you're not, find somebody who is and say, I would like for you to explain to me how Romans is written. Don't give me doctrinal studies on what it means. Explain to me, show me how it's written, so that when I read it, I can be appreciating what it's written and how it says it. We should be doing more of this teaching. I believe we should be doing more of this. I believe people should not only know what the text means, I think they should know what it says. Okay? Okay, so you would make a summary of how it's structured. I did a little one on Romans. And I just did the first 8 chapters because I find those to be the most together. At 9, it sort of diverges a little bit. I just didn't want to get into all that. So I just did 1 through 8 because this is a progressive argument that he makes starting from chapter 1. He ends in chapter 8 basically with this statement. Now it continues. I'm not saying it doesn't, but this is a very clear argument that he makes. It's a mistake to believe that I did it by chapters because it's easier for me to communicate. The breaks really aren't at the chapters. It's not exactly there, but it's roughly like this, right? The chapters aren't terrible divisions. For the most part, they're pretty good. So I just kept it like that. It's good enough for our purposes. So this is how I would, just in a very brief way, explain what Paul is saying in his text. He starts off by talking about mankind's descent into paganism. They went from knowing God to worshiping serpents, and how that happened and what that meant. Then he talks about the ascent of the Jewish people into hypocrisy, where they went from receiving the law of God to being hypocrites in the law of God. And that's pretty much chapter 2. And then in chapter 3, he deals with the inadequacy of that law, why it's inadequate, why we have to find another solution. That would be kind of chapter 3. And then in chapter 4, he deals with the primacy of faith, that it's first, that faith was before the law, and it's foremost. It's more important. So primacy meaning first and more important. That would be chapter 4. In 5, it's the gift of righteousness, that righteousness is given as a gift, not as something that's earned, and it's based on the faith that he talked about in 4. In 6, he goes into the liberty of death, that through death we are free from sin. And why that is, and he expounds on the liberty of death. In 7, he deals with the bondage of sin, and then in 8, he deals with the life of the Spirit. And so if we look at this and how this progresses, and you can go and check this, and you should, but if this is accurate, then we can look at this and say, okay, this is what he's talking about in Romans. Now, none of this is about me trying to make any doctrinal point. This is me reading this text 1 through 8 and trying to understand what he's saying and to summarize it in my own words. Because you have to put it in your own words. It is of no use, or practically no use, to just quote verses out of it. It doesn't prove you know anything. Not to yourself and not to anybody else. You have to put it into your own words. You have to write it down. I know most of us do not like writing. It's hard to write. It's painful to write. I hate writing. I do. I hate it because it torments me. But the writing is the only way you're thinking. I know that's a broad and a generalized statement, but it's generally true. You think, I can think without writing. I'm telling you, you cannot. Not in any meaningful way. Our brains are designed to conserve energy, right? When our brain is at rest, it consumes like 1/3 of a calorie a minute. Very little. The moment you start thinking, it's consuming 6 to 10 calories. Just a huge increase. It's astounding. Huh?
6 to 10%.
Yeah. It's just like boom. It's like consuming all the glucose in your system, or 1/3 of it actually. Your brain is going to do everything in its power to not do that, to conserve that energy. And so many times when we think we are thinking, we're really not. Our brain is deceiving us to think that we're thinking. How do you know you're thinking? That you're really contemplating, you're really working through the problem, writing it down. Because you can't trick yourself if you're doing that. Because you can read what you're writing. If it's a bunch of gobbledygook, you know you weren't thinking anything. You ever look back at something you wrote and look at that and go, what was I thinking? Exactly. Exactly. You have to write to think. You just do. Now, there may be a savant out there who can just sit there in the dark and conjure tremendous genius ideas. Great for him. You and I are not savants, most likely. I know I'm not. And if I want to think through something, I have to write it down. That's what you probably ought to do. You ought to sit down and take a text. You can take Hebrews or Ephesians or Galatians or whatever book you're interested in. I would encourage you to start with the epistles of Paul. They lend themselves to that. He wrote them in a logical way, so they lend themselves to this kind of analysis very easily. Sit down and start writing what you're thinking in your own words. What I do when I do it is I intentionally do not use the words that are found in the text, even if it's a better word, to force myself to think it. It's too easy to copy. If you're sitting there taking a test and there's a one next to you that's already been done and filled out, and you know it's right, the discipline of not looking at that, even if you know the answers, you're just like, oh, I know that answer, I'll write it down. You have to force yourself. Your brain will always try to take shortcuts. You have to force yourself to actually understand. It means you need to force yourself to write. And so this is what I did. I just went through. This is what I did this week. I went through Romans 1 through 8. Now, I wrote a really long summary of chapter 3, because that's the issue I was discussing with the brethren in Mexico online, the debate I was having. So I wrote a 16,000-word summary on chapter 3. But I went through for this class and just did this. And this is adequate in order for me to now look at this and get an idea of what I think the structure of this book is. Now, I could be wrong on some of these. This isn't like gospel. Don't take a picture of this and say, okay, now Romans is all figured out. There could be some mistakes in there, and we could probably quibble over some of these. Obviously, any summary is going to be insufficient. That's the point. But it gives me a good point to start as I'm looking at it, trying to figure out what he's saying. I've kind of broken it down. Now, what would I do after this? Well, then I would take each one and I would start expanding them. Expanding them. Because none of those completely summarize any one of those portions. There's a lot of information in each one. And I start expanding them and expanding them. But I'm not trying to figure out the doctrinal implication of them at this moment. I'm only trying to figure out what he wrote and why he wrote it. Let's look at one more example. I do not have a slide of it. I got just a very short amount of time, but let's look at one example so you can just see one that's not Romans. So let's look at 1 Timothy chapter 1. Very interesting thing that comes here. I'm not going to tell you the answer. I'm going to point it out to you, and then you can look at it. Oh, I'm in the wrong book. Hold on here. I hate these Bible programs. Someone needs to make one that's not garbage. Okay. Get it down here. I don't know. I'm trying to find somebody. What's that? Yeah. Okay. I'm going to point it out to you. So you have 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 11 says, according to the glorious gospel of the blessed God which was committed to my trust. Now that is not a complete sentence. You see that, right? That is a fragment of a sentence. The question here for you, and I would hope you would look at this week. You do this and well, you got 2 weeks because I'm going to be gone next week. But in 2 weeks, I'll get up here again and we'll look at this briefly. But what is he talking about? I don't want to know a doctrinal statement of what he's talking about. That's not what I mean. I mean, where does that tie into the text? Verse 1:11, 1 Timothy chapter 1, verse 11. According to the glorious gospel of the blessed God, which was committed to my trust. Now, just as a tip, it's obviously not the phrase before it. If there be any other thing that is contrary to sound doctrine according to the gospel, that doesn't fit. That is just not, that makes no sense. So it's obviously not a simple phrase that follows the previous one. So that's the question. You have 2 weeks. Look it over. Do some exegesis, because that's what you're doing. Remember, it's not about telling me what the gospel is. It's not about telling me why it's according to the gospel. It's just saying this text connects to this text because of this reason. Not a doctrinal reason, a grammatical reason, a rhetorical reason, a logical reason. You could do this even if you did not believe the Bible were true. Because you're just saying, how did Paul write it? How did he intend for it to be understood? That's exegesis. Now, exegesis is not the end. The end is interpretation and then application. So I'm not trying to say you do exegesis, you don't even have to believe the Bible. That's not what I'm saying. But I am saying that if you want to do proper interpretation and do helpful application, you need to learn to do exegesis. All right? All right. There you go. There's some homework for you. Yeah. We got to go. Did you see all that?